But if you're here at this event, especially in a room like this at the end of a long day, because I guarantee, I know you in this room right now, it's been a long day, your brains are probably full, but you are still going strong. You are probably an innovator. And what is an innovator? Well, there are attributes that define innovators. You are an active information seekers. You attend conferences like this. You have developed a breadth of knowledge, not just one topic, but you have that curiosity that pulls you in different directions. You've got more diverse interpersonal networks, and that comes from things like this, where you meet people, make new connections. You tend to be able to cope with more uncertainty. You are willing to explore and adopt new ideas. And in a word, innovators are venturesome. So if you are not an innovator now, the very fact that you're here, you probably will be. And that is a rare trait. In fact, innovators make up only 2.5% of a social system or an organization. And that means that the cognitive social diversity that you have offers insights into new ideas, usually ahead of the mainstream. So like I said, if you're not now, you probably will be. And when we talk about this, you might think, well, that's a good thing, right? But it actually puts you at a huge disadvantage. Now, as a metaphor to kind of explore these ideas, I'm going to draw on some pop culture, a film that was made about 10 or 12 years ago called Moneyball, based on a book by the author Michael Lewis that follows the season of the 2001 season of a baseball team, the Oakland Athletics. Now, we're in India, so if you're not super familiar with baseball, it's basically cricket for people who don't understand cricket. But it's an interesting story, and it's a great case study on how change happens, because that sport, baseball, in the U.S. was very traditional. And this team, this leader played by Brad Pitt, the lead of the team, the manager of the team, did something radically different. He took a data-driven approach to managing a ball team, and he ended up setting a new record. But it's a great example of how knowing the answers is not always enough. Here's a clip from that film. Whoever that ad is, they got a lot of bang for their buck.
An epidemic failure within the game to understand what is really happening. And this leads people who run Major League Baseball teams to misjudge their players and mismanage their teams. I apologize.
Listen. Go on.
Okay. People who run ball clubs, they think in terms of buying players. Your goal shouldn't be to buy players. Your goal should be to buy wins. And in order to buy wins, you need to buy runs. You're trying to replace Johnny Damon. The Boston Red Sox see Johnny Damon and they see a star who's worth $7.5 million a year. When I see Johnny Damon, what I see is an imperfect understanding of where runs come from. The guy's got a great glove. He's a decent leadoff hitter. He can steal bases, but is he worth the $7.5 million a year that the Boston Red Sox are paying?
No.
Baseball thinking is medieval. They are asking all the wrong questions. And if I say it to anybody, I'm ostracized. I'm a leper. So that's why I'm cagey about this with you. That's why I respect you, Mr. Bean. And if you want full disclosure, I think it's a good thing that you got Damon off your payroll. I think it opens up all kinds of interesting possibilities.
So you're from, Pete?
Maryland.
Where'd you go to school?
Yale. I went to Yale.
What'd you study?
Economics. I studied economics.
So, Yale, economics, baseball. We're Sonic, Pete.
Yale, economics, baseball. Three things that don't typically go together. By the way, I'll tell you something really interesting about this film and where we are right now. There was an actual person that was that was essentially who that character was kind of portraying, somebody who took on that role, but he didn't really want to be involved in the film project. So this character, Peter Brandt, that we just saw, was largely based on somebody named Ari Kaplan. And Ari was actually at this conference on this stage last year, and I got to meet him. And the way he was talking about the rejection of the ideas he was trying to bring, he said, I'm ostracized, I'm a leper. Ari was telling me some of the same stories here last year. He said, no, people would spit on me. That's how hostilely they reacted to what he was bringing to the organization, the change that he was trying to drive. And it was a good change. We know data-driven decisions are good, and people rejected this. But the thing is, he had diverse mental models, exposure to different ideas, different social circles. So this character, Peter Brandt, saw the answer, but like he said, he was an outsider. He had no credibility. And in fact, there's a great book by Everett Rogers called Diffusion of Innovations that this talk is largely based on. And he talks about this exact same phenomenon. He says the most innovative member of a system is very often perceived as deviant from a social system and is afforded the status of very low credibility by the average members of the systems. And that means the individual's role in diffusion, in other words, spreading the idea, especially in persuading others to adopt an innovation, is therefore very limited. So what that means is as we develop ourselves, as we get better at what it is that we do, and we try to show a possibility, a future to everybody else, they tend to ignore us. They tend to reject our ideas, which means that we are like Cassandra, who was in Greek mythology blessed by the god Apollo with the ability to foresee the future, and she could utter true prophecies. But the twist was that nobody would ever believe her. That's why she's pictured here standing on the ruins of a burning city, tearing her hair out, because if only they would have listened. So you either are or will be an innovator, but the big challenge is how do we lead change in the other 95.5% of the population? Because even if we have a good idea, it won't take off on the merits alone, even if there are clear and obvious advantages. The skeptics have to be won over. Old habits have to be discarded. These ideas have to be evaluated and explored. The whole process is slow and risky. But there is an art and a science to the diffusion of innovations, and this is necessary to be effective. So I want to empower you in this session to be more of a change agent. It's more rewarding, and this is helping you reach your true potential at the vanguard of technology. A little bit about me. My name is Micheal Carducci, and I've spent my life living at the intersection between magic and technology, as Kate said. And being a magician afforded me unique perspective on problems. Because think about it, engineering in general is about trying to get right up to the limits of possibility. Being a magician, we start at impossible. If you do a magic trick and it's not impossible, it's not worth doing. And so that's my job for so many years, for 30 years, doing the impossible. And when you do that, it gives you a very unique perspective on problems. You look at problems completely different. And it made me good at seeing the solutions, but despite my technical and my problem-solving skills, I was rarely effective. The reality is, our technical skills, that's just the ante. Our technical skills get us into the game, but all they do is get us into the game. Everything beyond that depends on everything else we bring to the table. So we need to learn how to be more influential. Change is not a technical process, it's a social process. And understanding this process, understanding the variables, becoming more skilled in dealing with people and navigating all the politics of the enterprise is unavoidable. Now, I pursued this in my entire career. I've read some books. These are some of the books I've read. Yet my track record for leading technical change remained checkered. And it was only after a particularly disappointing change initiative that I took a step back. I took in a personal retrospective. And I realized that if I was going to be consistently successful as an architect and an agent for transformational change, a deeper study was necessary. So I turned to the source, the granddaddy of them all, the definitive work, Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers. This is the book that studies how ideas spread, why they're adopted, why they fail, what are the variables. It chronicles a century of focused research on how this goes. It's a great book and it's a terrible book. It's a great book because it's comprehensive and academic and chock full of useful information, and it's a terrible book because it's academic, it's large, it's dense, and it talks about the problem, but it doesn't really tell you what to do beyond that. But this is the foundation for this session. So my goal is to make this more understandable and more sustainable. So whether you're an architect, a leader, an innovator, or you just want to move up the value chain in the organization and be more effective day to day, let's explore this topic. And this is particularly important because it turns out, according to the Carducci Institute, even in highly technical fields like engineering, only 15% of one's financial success is due to one's technical knowledge. The other 85% is due to human engineering and the ability to lead people. This is one of those crucial skills that will ladder you up the value chain in your organization and help you be super valuable, even as everything is shifting under our feet with Gen AI and everything else. But let's start at the beginning, how ideas spread. Because what was interesting reading that book is despite all the different case studies and all the different cultures and all the different contexts, there are remarkable similarities across all of these things. And one of the things we've all seen, especially in organization, is that everybody wants change, whatever that looks like, but nobody wants to change. But whenever we have a new idea, some innovation, some technical or idea or practice or tool or object that has some degree of potential benefit, any kind of thing that we want to change, we want to see take place, as we've established, the sphere of influence among a typical innovator is usually pretty small. And an innovation in the hands of a small number of innovators won't take root. The idea has to spread. It has to be increasingly adopted. So in practice, successful innovations spread from the innovator to a small number of early adopters. Now, if the early adopters are sufficiently well connected and sufficiently well regarded, the innovation will continue to spread to a larger group, the early majority, and it's typically at this point that the innovation, the change effort starts to reach a critical mass. And at this point, the diffusion and adoption of the idea will accelerate. And as other people see it, they get repeated confirmations of the benefit, then it's going to start to spread to the late majority, and finally, the most skeptical, the laggards, they'll start to adopt the innovation. So diffusion and adoption are usually slow to begin, but then around 10 to 20%, that's where you start to hit that critical mass, that's where it starts to accelerate, that's where it starts to become self-sufficient. But that's where that critical mass is, but it's hard to get there. But I'll just show you this in 3 minutes, what this actually looks like. From a lone innovator to spreading to almost everybody. There was a great talk, a TED Talk many years ago that took away some leadership lessons from a viral video that went viral years and years and years ago. And in fact, here is the video. It is the dancing guy. So we start with our lone innovator, alone on the hill dancing, and somebody's videoing him because they're like, look at this lunatic. He is perceived as deviant for the rest of the social circle. And so everybody just kind of looks on until we get our first early adopter. And he says, you know what? Dancing is actually fun. So we have an early adopter. And you'll notice there's a moment where he turns to his friends and kind of waves at them, waves them in just a little bit. So he's connected to larger groups. And in a few moments, one more person is going to come and join the party. And it starts to grow, and it starts to get critical mass. In fact, where is our next early adopter? 3, 2, 1. Now we have 3 people. There's safety in numbers, and we have another person who's more connected to the mainstream. Let's see what happens. Get a couple more. And more. And more. And we're starting to reach that critical mass. Now we're starting to form our early majority. If there's our early majority. And all these people who are just sitting there pointing and laughing a few minutes ago, now they're getting the FOMO, the fear of missing out. And now the late majority is starting to join. It's a very shaky video, by the way. And it's not 480p, it's like 80p. You never know how bad it is until you see it on this big of a screen. And now even our skeptics are getting involved. But this is how it works. And like I said, there's a great TED Talk. You should definitely look it up. It's something like the importance of being the first follower, the importance of the early adopters. Look at what happens in 90 seconds. This is how every successful change goes. So this sigmoid curve is really just a generalization of successful cumulative adoption. But getting to that critical mass, that's a big part. That's a big challenge. And becoming more than just an innovator, that's our challenge as visionaries on the vanguard of technology. So in other words, what gets you there, what makes you innovative, isn't going to get you here or help you here. In other words, we have to become change agents. So what are the key factors that we need to consider? Well, first, the innovation itself, whatever it is, the new idea, the new technology, the new tool, its positive and negative attributes, your ability to identify key people in the organization, find those ideal early adopters, and your relationships and your ability to influence people. Take any of these away, and your odds of success drop precipitously. But let's start at the beginning of that process, because innovations consistently follow a common development process. Given some problem, through some amount of research, the innovator will develop and formalize a solution which is then packaged in a way that it can be adopted. And at this point, the diffusion process can begin. Now, ultimately, there are consequences, right? The innovation can be rejected, adopted, reinvented, this happens, or adopted and later discontinued. But either way, the other thing that's worth pointing out as well, step 1 and step 2, those can happen out of order, right? Sometimes you see a problem, you recognize a problem or a need, and then you do some research and find some solutions. But sometimes you're looking at other solutions and you see something that makes you aware of a problem. Now, that said, be careful in that regard, because it's equally common to see a solution and say, this is so cool, I'm going to invent a need. By brute force rather than serendipity, so be careful. But there are hurdles in our journey, and I want to arm you to be able to cross these hurdles. The first one is the perception of a need. Now, we tend to have a pro-innovation bias. We tend to be techno-optimists. But the key to our success lies in the ability to connect a potential innovation to a genuine need in the organization, because change purely for change's sake is rarely a path to success or adoption. And the thing that we need to remember is that a lot of times perception is reality. There has to be a broad perception of the value of the change that we're trying to drive in the organization. Sometimes that means we have to shape perception, and we have to deal with one unshakable perception that change equates to risk. Like, organizationally speaking, change is risk. Driving change, however, requires communicating that the risk of inaction outweighs the risk of action. And a lot of managers, for example, are very risk averse. Perception is going to drive motivation. Now, human motivation tends to fall into two categories. We're either motivated towards pleasure, in other words, the change will make something measurably better, or away from pain, in other words, this change is going to eliminate a major pain point. And that latter one is always stronger. So that means that speculative innovations or preventative innovations, those are usually harder to sell because we haven't felt the pain yet. So that's the big one, the risk of action versus the risk of inaction. That's what we need to communicate, and that gets harder when it's speculative, or it's the feeling that it's solving a problem that we haven't yet experienced. Now, that's another difficult one for us, and that brings back our Cassandra metaphor, because Cassandra would warn us of things that were going to happen, and nobody would believe her. And you've been in situations, I'm sure, where you saw a problem on the horizon, and you tried to warn people, we need to do this thing differently, and they didn't want to do anything differently until finally that bad thing happened. I remember I worked for an organization, and we didn't have a disaster recovery plan. Now, I don't like writing those types of documents. It's boring to me, but I worked with a guy who loved that kind of thing. And every time we'd have an IT meeting, he would try to bring up his disaster recovery plan, but there was always something that seemed more important, because after all, we'd never had a disaster. And then one day we had an outage, and in a short couple of days from that disaster, we wiped out 3/4 of our annual profit. Suddenly people felt the pain. Suddenly they wanted to talk about the disaster recovery plan. And it's a good thing we did, because after that, everybody was all about it, because we finally felt the pain. That's why the perception of a need matters, the type of benefit matters, because that was always preventative. It was always hypothetical until it wasn't. And we know with these things, it's not always a case of if, but when. And in fact, I'll tell you something. It was really interesting when we did the DR testing. We actually went to a disaster recovery site, and we tried to bring everything back online. And that was when we learned we didn't have a single backup of anything. See, every day, at the end of the day, we had a whole process, and we had a whole sheet, and we'd fill it out and, log things and stuff like that. At the end of the day, the appointed person would go in the server room and put a tape in the backup machine, and then go home. And the next morning, the appointed person would go into that room, take the tape out, label it, and stick it into the safe. Well, what was happening? This was a headless backup server. And as soon as the backup job would start at about 2 a.m., it would immediately fail, and it would kick out the tape. And then somebody would take a blank tape and label it and put it in the safe. So when we were trying to restore everything, we didn't have anything to restore. And I don't know if you've ever done a DR test. Stuff's expensive. We're like, no, this has to be successful. It was actually really fun, because I'm not supposed to be able to go back to the main site during a DR test. There's like rules about this stuff. But I had to sneak back in and try to avoid the cameras and sneak in the fire exit. And I felt like I was on Mission Impossible. Dun, 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 dun. That song was playing in my head, but I finally got it working back up, and we made some things happen. And so that's the problem. We know an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but people don't always see it that way until they have to. Now, there's a really interesting book I read a while ago called Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. And what he discovered was that the most successful and most influential people actually spend time laying the groundwork for what it is that they're trying to convince people of. And he identifies several sources of persuasion, like attention. There's different kinds of attention that we can use here. He calls them privileged moments, when we are especially receptive. And when we had that outage and lost a ton of money, we were especially receptive. But calling your attention to certain things as well makes it easier to see what's present or what's missing. Another way that you can use attention to your benefit to be more persuasive is to ask what he calls single shoot questions. This is a line of question where the answer to all of these things is yes. You're focusing attention on different aspects of the problem or the solution. And in fact, there's a really great example of this in a TV show called Yes, Prime Minister. And you can exactly see how the single shoot questions will lead you to one side or the other side of where you want the focus to be. Let's see if that works.
Something new and radical in the broadcast.
What, that silly grand design? Bernard, that was precisely what you had to avoid.
How did this come about? I shall need a very good explanation.
Well, he's very keen on it.
What's that got to do with it? But the things don't happen just because prime ministers are very keen on them. Neville Chamberlain was very keen on peace.
Yes, he thinks it's a vote winner.
Ah, that's more serious. Sit down. What makes him think that?
Well, the party who had an opinion poll done, it seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, I have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
We can't be for it, and
Of
against.
course I can, Bernard. Have you ever been surveyed?
Yes, well, not me, actually, my house. Oh, I see what you...
Yeah, Bernard, you know what happens. Nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously, you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you? No. So she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Willie, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told, you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions, they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. But alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
Let's change the attention.
Mr. Wooding, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
There you are, you see, Bernard.
It's all about the attention. So that's what the single shoot questions are. Or another way that you can use the feature of attention is ask people questions to kind of frame the rest of it. For example, if you have somebody on a team that is maybe a little more resistant to a certain idea, I might ask this question. Do you like working with kind of the new and exciting technologies, or do you prefer what is old and established? New, yes. Now I'm going to introduce something new, and I've completely shifted your attention on the topic. And now you're going to be more open to a new idea than you would have otherwise if I had just kind of made that suggestion right away. So you can start to see that psychology can be really important here. Whoop, that's the wrong button. Another one is the focusing illusion. Our tendency to assume what we're focusing on is more important. So what you can do is draw attention to one key trait or feature of your innovation to give it undue importance. Another one is assumed causality. We assume what we're focusing on is the cause of an issue. Survival and self-reliant stimuli. We're more attracted to things that are more relevant to our survival or goals. That's another good way to frame for the organization. A good way that my colleague could have done this all those years ago with the disaster recovery plan is just ask the question, what would be the impact if our systems were down for 2 days? Do you think it's a case of if or when? Should we talk about disaster recovery planning? These are just different ways that you can frame the question. And another one, the last one, ease and familiarity. A lot of times we get so excited about a new innovation, whether it's a framework or technology or a language or anything else, and we want to dive right into it. One of the most valuable things we can do is just introduce the idea earlier. I worked with a colleague who really wanted to get involved. This was 10, 12 years ago. He really wanted to get involved with the emerging the new generation of web development frameworks. Now, he could have just come to the team and says, hey, I think we should rewrite everything in AngularJS. But we would have all been like, but I'm really good at this MVC stuff, and I'm really good with jQuery, and I'm comfortable with it. That sounds like a lot of change. It sounds like a lot of stuff I have to learn. I don't know anything about AngularJS. This was a long time ago. Don't judge me. But instead, he started hosting these lunch and learn sessions. And on one of those sessions, he came in and gave a presentation on AngularJS and showed it to us. And we're like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, it's really neat that you can do this. That was the end of it. He wasn't selling anything. We were just all getting together once a week or twice a month to kind of explore new ideas and look at new stuff. And then later on, when he said, hey, maybe this new project we should use AngularJS. We were familiar with it now. It wasn't nearly so scary, and it was a very different conversation. So that's the first one, that perception of a need. The second one is finding a solution. Now, it seems like there tends to be a solution for everything, but we have to evaluate these things holistically. Figure out if the solution is in reach of the teams, the organization, the process, everything else. I worked with a client once that was really interested in feature flagging, and we thought Launch Darkly was super cool, but the thing is, I didn't want to drive as cool as I thought that was. I didn't want to drive it because I realized we weren't doing any of the processes in our software delivery lifecycle that was going to bring this thing value. And so realizing that this is a cool tool, but it's a little bit out of reach. So we've got to, sometimes when we have an idea, we have to either take a step back and realize that we might involve a larger scope of change. It's not just bringing in a tool now, it's changing the way we work, which is going to bring more risk, or compromise the innovation for compatibility, which is more risk. We've got to kind of connect these things back and forth. Now, the third thing that we have to consider is packaging for adoption. You see, whenever something changes, anytime we introduce any kind of change, there's always going to be disruption. This is called the J curve. And what you'll notice here is this is where we start. This is the status quo. And there's this idea that this change, this innovation is going to bring us up higher. It's going to elevate our practice, elevate whatever it is. And we want to believe that it's just going to be a nice straight line up to the top. But the reality is it's always going to invite disruption. And that's what the J curve dip is. And we see this sometimes. These are hugely disruptive. I remember reading about a case in the 90s adopting personal computers in organizations. It was about a 30% drop in productivity for almost a year. Now, we know, obviously, in hindsight, that was a good change. Like doing everything on paper with typewriters and all the rest of it, that was not sustainable. You couldn't be competitive. But we don't always anticipate that J-curve dip. But what we want to do is we want to package our solution. Packaging is all about removing as much adoption friction as possible to minimize that dip. And so this could be documentation, standards, building a proof of concept, a reference implementation, developer tooling, training, coaching, mentoring, automation. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but this is a really key step. You've got to change. How can we package this in a way that it's going to minimize the disruption? Because there will always be disruption. And knowing that is a huge part of making you more influential as a change agent. Forewarned, as they say, is forearmed. And then we need to reach a critical mass, because even properly packaged, you have to find that critical mass, as we've seen. Now, a great example of this is we know the QWERTY keyboard is inefficient. We know, in fact, that in the 1930s, Augustus Dvorak realized it was inefficient, and he decided he's going to design a keyboard layout that is extremely efficient and well optimized for our language and for how our hands work, and he created what we call the Dvorak keyboard layout. Does anybody type on this layout? Yeah. Even though it's more efficient, even though it causes less strain on your hands and your wrists and everything like that, even though it's well packaged, you have this layout on your computer. It doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Mac, Linux, it's out there, it's ready, it's even on your phone, it's even available on your phone. But it shows us the superior ideas don't always win. Me, myself, I don't use that layout. I use a variant of it because I'm weird. This is Programmer Dvorak. It's even more optimized, but optimized not just for the English language, but for programming. You'll notice the number keys are in the shifted position because we type symbols a whole lot more than we type numbers. And the 0 and 1 are the digits we type the most. That's why they're under the index fingers. It's much better than having to do this every time you want to type a parenthesis. But I went from typing 60 words a minute to typing 12 for weeks. And then I finally got back up to my normal speed. I can today type 140 words a minute, it turns out. That's what I test at. 140 words a minute, and on a good day, 100% accuracy. That's good for bragging and not much else, because it turns out for me, the problem is not how fast I can type. It's how fast I can think, and I cannot think in code at 140 words a minute. But the thing is, it may be superior, but almost nobody uses it. It never reached critical mass. And, that's the thing. We're ingrained in our habits. So we have to get that critical mass. And there's usually a time limit. And so we have to think about who our early adopters are going to be. Because we can't just have this idea and say, hey, look at this cool idea, everybody go and adopt it. We need to be proactive if we want to increase our odds of success. This is a key part of the art of innovation. So we want to find early adopters, but the right early adopters matter. What we're looking for is people who are better connected but still open-minded, people who can be opinion leaders in the organization. They're respected by their peers, but they're not too ingrained in their habits. Let's go back to the film Moneyball for a moment. This is Art Howe, the manager of the team, and he reports up to Billy Beane, the person who's trying to drive this change. And he says, Billy Beane was always very far away from the players as a general manager. He wanted to keep it strictly business, didn't want personal feelings to get involved. If he had to cut somebody, he could just say, hey, you're cut, and not feel bad about it. So he always kept this professional distance. And he thought, well, Art Howe, well respected by the team, well connected, because he's with them in the trenches every single day. He's my good early adopter. Let's see how that goes.
Paying it.
Okay.
It's not going well.
Well, dying right. Just as DHing, hanging on the bench, had very first. With the one but man's first out on the bench.
See, for the data-driven strategy to work, the team has to be played a certain way.
You play kind. Handy is not only the best first baseman on the roster, he's the only first baseman on the roster had hits on base more than, in fact, 20%. And this fielding that is not. I have enough of this conversation. Have you? And I disagree with you. Plain and simple. And moreover, I'm playing my team in a way that I can explain in job interviews on Twitter.
That's not a sign of confidence.
Well, I'll bend down.
And Art Howe decides, nope, I'm going to play the team my way. See, he was respected by his peers. He had influence on the team, but he was a laggard. He was a skeptic. He was traditional. So all this effort to drive Howe to be that early adopter just led to desk-flipping levels of frustration. And it was only after half a season of failure that Billy Beane pivots to find early adopters on the team. All right. So he goes off and starts building these relationships that he's ignored for so long with the team. It took time. It was a new skill that he had to develop. But he found those early adopters. But that's another thing that we have to know. If we want to be influential, then skill in communication, building relationships, and the persuasion aspect are crucial. So how we manage this and the extent of our efforts have significant impact on whether or not the innovation is going to be adopted. Robert Cialdini had another book on this. If you want to start to develop the skill, this is definitely worth checking out. It's called Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion. If you read one, read Persuasion, because it kind of covers both. If you want to dive deeper, read both of these. But the next hurdle that we have is managing diffusion, because once the idea gets out there, we're going to lose control over it. Because, once the idea starts to take off, there's this assumption that the success is going to be inevitable. But this is not the finish line. Only with careful planning and management of the process, even with careful planning and management of the process, the innovation can still fall flat. So first, we have to accept the very real possibility that the benefits won't materialize. This happens sometimes. And in that case, the innovation is typically discontinued or abandoned. Our only real option at this point is to do a bit of a post-mortem and see what we can do to improve our skills, our mental models, our processes, and things like that. Another thing that we need to be aware of is as an idea or tool or a technology spreads, it's going to be often reinvented in different cases. So when we tackled the second hurdle, we do our best to fit the innovation to the organization, but in most cases, the organization is going to adopt the innovation during the adoption process. Now, this happens for a lot of reasons. Innovations that are hard to understand are more likely to be reinvented. This can be extremely problematic. This is why I've seen a lot of microservices efforts fail, because they're hard to understand and people kind of go back to what it is that they know. Reinvention can occur owing to an adopter's lack of detailed knowledge. An innovation that's too general or has multiple possible applications is more likely to be reinvented. Sometimes when an innovation is implemented to solve a wide range of problems, reinvention is more likely to occur. It happens for a lot of reasons. But the thing is, reinvention can be a positive thing, right? This is where people are taking it and running with it. So don't always think this is a bad thing. Now, I mentioned microservices. We've got about 18 minutes left, so I want to talk a little bit about the attributes of an innovation. Because clearing any or all of these hurdles, we still have challenges. So if you want to be more skilled in the art of innovation, because the art of innovation isn't just having the idea, it's getting it out there. It's making a difference with your idea. Then we need to start to understand different ways to look at it. So Everett Rogers in his book gives us 5 attributes of an innovation. So let's look at a potential technical innovation through this lens. We're going to look at microservices. And microservices is a powerful but challenging architecture. And in fact, in 2017, Gartner predicted that by 2019, 90% of organizations who try to adopt microservices will fail because they find the paradigm too disruptive. So let's look at this through those variables. Now, we know there's relative advantage when we look at the illities of different architectures. Microservices are very strong in some of the illities. But and another advantage that's not on this slide is that microservices in architecture, like this is the kind of thing that somebody will brag about. Yeah, we're doing microservices and we're doing amazing with it. So that's another thing we have to remember is that feelings are facts. Feelings are facts. So that's kind of an intangible but very real advantage. It's not just the objective advantages that factor into all of this. But relative advantage of the innovation is all about the why. Relative advantage is the first thing. The second one is compatibility. It's an architecture that requires significant changes to practices and mental models and how we run the organization. Conway's Law is very clear that you can't just design microservices because your org chart, the structure of the organization, has to match your architecture. And there's another compatibility issue. There are very radical changes to how we think about software. We're taking extreme decoupling into account here. And so things like don't repeat yourself for a lot of developers have become a religion. But in microservices, we're trying to achieve this high level of decoupling. So we say, please repeat yourself. Reuse is abuse. There's other compatibility things. It's a distributed architecture that we have to deal with. And in fact, Everett Rogers said, old ideas are the main mental tools that individuals utilize to assess new ideas and give them meaning. Individuals cannot deal with an innovation except on the basis of the familiar. So for a lot of organizations going into microservices for the very first time, there's very little that's familiar in here. And so in addition to low compatibility, this innovation is very complex. Complexity is the third variable. Incredibly difficult to execute well. And I mentioned, and because of these factors, people are more likely to reinvent these things, but probably reinvent these in not very productive ways. Microservice is a very high precision architecture and requires a very high precision process, because when you take things apart into a bunch of little pieces, eventually we have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And if we're not very precise in this, we have a bunch of pieces that aren't going to go together very well. So we cannot forget this fact. The fine-grained and extremely decoupled nature, they're rarely compatible with norms, and people are going to shoehorn their old ideas into all of this. Now, the fourth one is observability. At a high level, observability is the degree to which the results of an innovation are visible to others. The easier it is to see the results, the more likely other people will adopt them. So we have to think about, how do we measure this? How do we show success? What do we measure? What matters to the people that we want to convince? These are questions that we have to ask. And we have to think about how to measure these things, how to demonstrate that success. Observability is correlated to increased or decreased adoption. And the last one is trialability. Do we have to do everything all at once? I remember years and years ago when a lot of the early Agile stuff, before we ruined it with enterprising all the things, was taking off. I was talking to my team. We were doing the lunch and learns and things like that, getting familiar with the ideas. We got to a point that we wanted to try being an Agile team, doing it kind of the right way, from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And we had to convince management. And we start laying all this out to management, and they were very skeptical. And then finally I said, look, let's just do this for 6 weeks and see how we feel about it. There's no amount of damage that we can do in 6 weeks that we can't undo in 6 weeks. We're just going to try it out. What we're doing here with trialability is we're reducing the perceived scope of the change. It's just an experiment, not all or nothing. So that trialability is another powerful one. And in fact, Everett Rogers says this: the trialability of an innovation, as perceived by the members of a social system, is positively related to the rate of adoption. So how do we optimize some of these attributes? Well, if our goal is to be successful, then we have to think about how we can do this, how we can tweak these numbers in our favor. We want to stack the deck in our favor. We want loaded dice. We want to be successful. Now, if you're trying to drive change, my friend and co-author Daniel Tippy pointed out this. This is why I brought him in to contribute to my book, because he's got some really good ideas and experience on this. He said there are 5 requirements for change: authority, accountability, responsibility, know-how, and will. Do you have all 5 of those? Neither do I. But that means you have to take stock of what you have, and you have to figure out who has the rest. And these are the people that you're going to want to influence. These are the people that you have to figure out what keeps them up at night, what their pain points are, and then use some of the other things that we talked about. So how do we optimize relative advantage? Ultimately, we're answering the question, what's in it for me? Now, when I'm talking to developers about an idea that I want to explore, trial, I usually try to answer 3 questions right away. What is the thing? What does it do? And why should I care? Why should they care? It doesn't matter if I sit here and talk about what I think is useful. I need to figure out why they should care. And so we need to ask these questions, ask ourselves these questions about who we're trying to present: managers, stakeholders, team leads, individual developers, architects, investors. Whoever these different audiences are, they're going to have different perspectives on all of these different aspects. Now, another thing that we should think about is how these decisions are being driven, because Rogers shows us there are 3 types of decisions. There are authority-driven decisions where somebody from the top down says, this is how it's going to be. There's collective decisions, and there's individual optional decisions. Now, the authority-driven decisions, they're the easiest. They're the quickest, because you have to just find that authority who can make that mandate, find out what's in it for them, find out what the value is to them, start making that case using some of the other techniques that we talked about, and let them drive that out. The challenge is you still need to figure out how to support the innovation with the packaging, with maybe bringing champions in to kind of guide this in the organization. The collective decisions are usually more sustainable because people feel like they have some say in it. You've got a group of different people that they're going to come to some kind of consensus. Those tend to be more sustainable. But it can be a little more challenging because you've got a lot of different opinions. What I like to do in those situations is find those influential people in that group and try to understand what their pain points are. Again, what's in it for them, whoever they are, and kind of let these things drive the conversation. Call out those specific points. Get them on your side. And I try to do that for different people in these committees, in these organizations, because they can be those early adopters and they can be our champions. Now, the last one is the individual optional decisions. These are the hardest. The Dvorak keyboard is a perfect example. Every single one of us has a choice. And most of us, we've decided not to. It's too much work for not enough benefit. And honestly, that's a fair statement. Like, if you asked me today what I recommended, I'd say no. But the worst thing, by the way, about the Dvorak keyboard is you have to unlearn the QWERTY to learn the Dvorak. And that means you can't type on anybody else's computer. And I'm an independent technology consultant. People talk me up. They say, this guy's a wizard. Wait till you see what he can do. And then they put me in front of their computer and they say, go on, Michael, show him something. They're looking at me. This is our wizard? Which is a real shame, because if more people were doing it, it would be better, it'd be easier to switch back and forth. But this one usually is the slowest due to its wide-reaching audience. So if you find yourself in this situation where this is how it's going to work, this is where more effort is needed on our part. So, like, for example, if I had an innovation and I wanted everybody in this room to adopt it, but you all had an individual choice, you could do it or not. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to group you. I want to try to group you into common groups with common challenges. And then that allows me to segment and tailor my communication to different groups. So when I'm talking to this group, I'm going to talk about how this innovation deals with your pain points. And when I'm with this group, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. Another thing that we can do as well is in situations like that, we have to scale ourselves. We have to build, we have to maybe bring people in from these different groups, win them over, and let them be champions on our behalf. But the main thing is tailoring things for these different groups, so that will facilitate peer-to-peer information sharing. For compatibility, think about how your innovation aligns with current ways of working and thinking, because the adoption depends on compatibility with the existing processes and mindsets and things like that. Another one is don't get too excited. Don't try to change everything all the time. There's a great film from probably 20 years ago, far too long for me to be happy about it. And in that film, it says the world only tolerates one change at a time. Now, personally speaking, this is one of the hardest realities that I've had to accept in my career. And a lot of times meaningful change has to take place in stages. So, I gave a talk years ago. It might have been here. I might have done it here. I'm not sure. But I read and was very inspired by Robert Cialdini's Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. I wrote a talk about it called The Influential Engineer. And I talked about the 6 principles of persuasion, which are reciprocity, consistency. Oh my gosh, I'm as tired as you are today, by the way, just so you know. Reciprocity, authority, being liked. Actually, I have a cheat sheet here. I'm going to look at it. Consensus, This is embarrassing. Gosh. Scarcity and consistency. Right? Did I say that already? I don't know. It's been a long day. Thank you for long daying into the end of this long day with me. But I wrote a second talk because it was one thing to talk about the principles of influence, and I realized that I wanted to give people more tools. So I wrote a second talk called Persuasion Patterns, and I talked about different tools that you can use over and over again to be more persuasive, and I gave a bunch of case studies. And one of them was taking an organization that did manual builds twice a year, and it still happens. And if that's the existence that you live in, I'm not going to make you raise your hand. You're suffering enough. We know how painful that can be. And moving them in the direction, moving them in the direction of continuous delivery. Now, that is a radical change. And so what we did was we broke it all down. We broke it down into meaningful stages that would deliver value, but we could just make one little change at a time. You know what? Let's just set it up so every time we do a commit, it does an automatic build. Nothing big, nothing scary, no big deal. Hey, what if we ran some tests? Hey, what if we wrote some tests? And bit by bit, over 2 years, we moved the company to doing 4 releases a week, typically on average, with very mature CI/CD pipelines. Our lives got a lot better. We weren't terrified by every release. But the thing is, perfection is the enemy of progress. Try to change one thing at a time, small steps towards a larger goal. For optimizing complexity, remember the ideas that are simpler to understand are adopted more readily. So how do we make things simpler to understand? These are really great things. Create learning guilds, create book clubs, create these regular lunch and learn sessions, build proof of concepts. Not only are they fun, they're very useful. Build tooling, build reference implementations, define a training plan. These are little things that you can invest and plant seeds. Not only does it make you more connected to the rest of the organization, but these are ideal forums to drive innovation in the future. So it's a way to kind of plan and take advantage of these things. Optimizing trialability. Just think about how do we break this down into these trials? And when you're doing a trial, what are we hoping to show? What are we going to measure? What is the data? That the innovation is successful, that the problem is tractable, that the benefits are materializing, that this is better than the status quo. To quote Peter Drucker, you can't improve what you don't measure. Now, we're coming up to the last 90 seconds of this session, and somehow 141 slides, we've actually made it. And I don't think I was talking too fast. In fact, I'm not sure if I'm talking at all at this point because, like I said, I'm feeling what you're feeling. Trust me. So but the key with this, figure out what you can measure and show to reduce uncertainty and communicate this stuff. So to put it all together, in Rogers's book, we can see the variables, we can see the things, and how they're related. But ultimately, I'll leave you with this. Becoming a change agent who makes innovation happen is a long game. You have to play the long game. It's not something you can just go and do. You want to plan, you want to move forward, and sometimes we have to strategically invest in different areas. But the thing is, there's no shortcuts, there's no risks. It requires a unique set of skills that you can develop, and you definitely want to develop, especially in the age of AI, because this is where you're bringing unique value. It was got the skills, the foresight, planning. Now, we're never going to master these skills, myself included. But even bare proficiency will make us more effective and make you more effective on whatever role or title you hold. And not only that, being able to lead and drive technical change is going to result in a much more satisfying career and in life. And for me as a practicing software architect, I've long learned that I cannot be effective without these skills. I find the practice to be of equal importance, if not more so, than my core hard architect skills. And so the more time I spend in this industry, and the more I find this is true in all roles, in all cases, regardless of what your title or seniority is or anything else. And I know we're out of time, but I thank you for making it to the end of this day with me.